Welcome to another module. Let's dive deeper into CSS, and if we were to give this module a different title, it would probably be Working with Boxes. And after this module, you'll also know why. Specifically, we'll dive into the box model, a core part of CSS, really easy to understand, thankfully, but really important to know too, so that is what we'll start with. We'll then have a look at how we can actually change the height and width of elements. We'll have a look at the display property, which helps us with layouting our page and positioning elements next to each other, for example. And we'll also dive into properties worth to remember. I mentioned that there is this complete reference of properties and CSS features, which you can always consult if you want to dive deeper. But there also is a common set of properties you work with a lot, so I want to share some of the properties I personally find to be the most important ones. And finally, we'll have a look at these pseudo classes and elements I already mentioned in the last course section. Now we'll learn what they are and what you can do with them. So with that, let's just get started and let's continue working on our web page. So let's continue working on this web page, and I want to continue with this red block. Right now it doesn't look super impressive. Would be nice if it were a little bit bigger, had more height, maybe some spacing inside of it, and also that white space around it. I want to get rid of that too. Until we add a navigation bar, this red block should be the very first element on our page without surrounding white space. Now, we can achieve this, we can add all these things, we can control how the block is designed or how much space it takes up by working with the box model. Now, what do I mean with that? Every element in HTML is interpreted as a box by CSS. And you can see that box in the Chrome Developer Tools if you inspect that element. And again, you can really select any element. So here I selected the H1 element. Now let's pick the section element, but again, any would do it. And if you then, at the bottom, scroll down below your styles and the inherited styles, you'll see this box. This is how CSS thinks about an element. Every element has a content, that's the blue area. That's really what's inside of it. So for this section, the content actually is the H1 tag. For the H1 tag, the content is its text. So we got that content, the blue area, and then we can add a padding. Now we got none here, indicated by that dash, but we could add a padding, which is some internal space within that section element from the content to the next part, the border. We can add a border to each element. Now we don't have a border here, so we'll add all these things in just a second, of course. A border surrounds an element and directly comes after the padding, which in turn comes directly after the content. Now finally, we sometimes also want to have some spacing around an element, and that would be the margin. It's not part of the core element, that ends with the border, including the border, but it comes after that. It's the distance you have between that element and its next sibling. For example, the H1 element has a margin by default. It's set by the browser. You can see this if you scroll up to the browser defaults. There you have that strange margin before and after thing. Well, that's just the default browser margin. And there you can see this element happens to have a margin of 19.92 pixels to the top and bottom. That's this orange area, which is also indicated on the top left corner, so here in the loaded page. As you can see already, the margin goes outside of the surrounding section container because it's not part of the element, which in turn is the content of the section. Now, since the margin is not part, it's not part of the content and therefore not part of the section. This is the box model. These layers, the content, the padding, the border, the margin. Every element is interpreted as such a box in CSS. Now, there are two different types of elements then. Block level and inline, something I'll cover in this module too, where some of these things will differ a bit, but I'll dive into that. For now, let's simply keep in mind that every element has these layers. Now let's work with that. We had a look at that box model in theory, Let's now work with it. And let's work with it by going to our product overview selector here, the ID selector where we have the background, and let's add a padding of 20 pixels, for example. So pixels is a unit you can use in CSS. There are other units like percentages and font-related units too, but for now let's stick to pixels since they're very easy to understand. So if we add this and save that file, we can reload the page, and now we see that there is some spacing around the text. If we now inspect that section again, we can already see it on the left if we hover over it, that there are different boxes now. And if we now scroll down, we indeed see there is a padding, and this time the padding is even around the margin of the H1 tag, which can look strange at first since this wasn't considered previously. It's just that if you add a padding, then the content of the element is to be considered the content plus any margins it might have, because padding and margins shouldn't overlap, hence the padding is added after the margin of child elements. So here we got our padding added. We can hover over it in the box model to see it highlighted in the top left. And of course we can also add a border now. So let's add a border. Let's add 5 pixels, black and solid. Now this value might look strange at first, to this way of writing a value. We have more than one value. This is called a shorthand. I'll also dive into this in a second. This is just a shorter way of writing border style solid, border color black, border width 5 pixels, but you could use this notation too. If you add this and reload the page, you see a black border around the element. And if you again scroll down to your box model, you see the 5 pixels here. And if we hover over it, the border gets highlighted in the top left, so in the loaded page too. Now finally, let's add a margin to complete the box model. If we add a margin here, let's say 20 pixels, and we save that and then we reload the page one more time. Again, if we scroll down, we can see that margin here, and if we hover over it, we see that orange margin around our box. We still see some white space to the left and right, and that is something I'll revisit very soon too. But with that, we see all layers of the box model in action. Now, there are a couple of special things you also gotta know about the box model and default styles of the web page. So let's dive into these things step by step over the next lectures. We had a look at the box model basics with padding, a border, and a margin. And all these things are, of course, optional. You can have a padding and a margin without a border. You can have a border without a padding and margin. So that's all totally optional. And it leads to that result. Now, I mentioned there would be a couple of special things. Now, let's dive into these special things step by step. The first special thing can be seen if you inspect the section. There is some white space to the left and to the right, so after the orange margin. This is coming from the body actually. If you hover over the body, you can see the body also has a default margin. Here, the 8 pixels. That is simply coming from the browser defaults here. So what we can do to, prevent this and to make sure that our elements go directly into the edges of our page, we can set that margin to 0 with that margin 0 command. If we do that and we reload the page, you see now the body has no longer a margin, and therefore, if we inspect the section, you indeed see the orange area around it. So its margin directly connects to the edges of the page, which means there is no additional space in between. So that was the first special thing, that the body has a margin. Another special thing can be seen if we inspect the H1 tag in our second section, in the plants section. You see, this has a margin to the top and bottom, the default margin every H1 element has. We can see it here, it's orange. Now the interesting thing is, if we also inspect the section above it, so the product overview section, do you see that orange margin at the bottom of it? Keep in mind where it was. If I go back to the H1 tag, it overlaps with that section from the product overview container. This behavior is called margin collapsing. It simply means the following. If you got two elements, block element with its box model, the margin is the orange part here. If you got two elements next to each other, then margins between them are actually collapsed to one margin. The bigger margin wins. This is not a bug, this is on purpose. This is there, or this is enforced by CSS to ensure that you don't get too big distances between the elements. Now you could argue, hey, leave that up to me, I'll take care about that. But that's simply not how CSS works, so it is something to be aware of. To work around this, it's a good practice to use either margin top or margin bottom, unless you don't worry about this collapsing occurring, which of course also can be the case. So in our case, we got some collapsing. It's not really a problem because we got a fine distance between the elements. I just want to highlight it here so that you don't wonder what's going on here. Now that we had a look at the box model, we also implicitly got a first glimpse at shorthand properties. To be very precise, we already used shorthand properties since we first started using background. Shorthand properties are simply normal properties that combine the values of multiple other properties in a single property, the so-called shorthand property. Here are some examples. We got some separate properties, let's say. Border width, style, and color. This is what we already saw. And style is either dashed or solid, let's say. Now, of course, there are other ways too, like dotted. You can always find all available options in the reference, in the MDN reference for that property. But these are the individual properties that allow you to construct a border. If you only set two of them and omit one, the default for that property will be used, which could lead to no border being displayed or the border being solid even though you wanted it to be dashed. Well, if you don't specify that, the default will be used. There is a shorthand for this because it's of course a bit more cumbersome to always define a border like this. Border width, style, color, that's a lot to type. Therefore we got shorthands, and the shorthand for border would look like this. It's just called border, and then we simply assign the values for the different sub-properties, so to say. The order here doesn't matter, as long as the sub-properties don't use the same type of value, which isn't the case for border. For other shorthands, it will be the case, and I will highlight this and tell you how to circumvent this once it is the case. So for border, we could mix the order of the arguments here, of the values, in whichever way we want. The core is that this will be interpreted in exactly the same way as it is on the left. Another example would be margin. We didn't even use that notation until now. We used the one where we just had margin, colon, and then 20 pixels. Now actually the margin has a couple of shorthands. It's always just margin, but you could write it like this, and this would read as top, right, bottom, and left. So this is a shorter way of setting the margins for the different directions. If you want to set top and bottom and left and right to the same, you could use this notation. The first value is then set for the top and bottom margin, the second one for left and right. And if you want to use the same margin on all sides, as we did it, then you would use margin with one value. Now this will be applied to all sides. These are shorthand properties. We use a lot of shorthands in CSS, and I will always mention them once we use one or once we can use one. Again, we already did it for background. I'll dive deeper into what background covers or which other values are part of background later in the course, once we also add background images. It's important that you should use shorthands if you have the chance to do so, simply because it's cleaner and shorter code. But you can always use the longer version. And what you can also do is you can define a shorthand version, and later, let's say in another class with a higher specificity, you could override one part of that. If you, for example, want to keep the border color and only change the width, you would define the border shorthand first, and then in the overriding rule, you would just define the border width. It would still take the old setup from the shorthand and then only override that single part of it. So that's also a nice way of working with shorthands. But again, this will all be something we see in the course. Let's quickly see shorthands in action then. As I said, we already use shorthands. The backgrounds are shorthand. The padding actually is a shorthand. It works like the margin. Margin is one. Here we use the longer form. Now we can get rid of that and instead simply use border 5 pixels solid black or any other order of these values. The margin here, of course, is a shorthand. And with that, let's inspect that in the developer tools and see how they can help us with that. If we again select the first section where we have padding, border, margin, and background, so where we already have 4 shorthands, in the developer tools you can always click this tiny arrow here to see which long form properties are combined. Now here you see all the properties that make up the background. Again, this is something I'll dive into later. This is simply a very complex way, since you can also use background images, which you can then position with the various sub-properties. For solid colors, they don't matter. But there you see, we implicitly set background color by assigning a color to background. So this would be the long form property name, background color. For the padding, we see that this could be split up into padding top, right, bottom, and left. And it works, as I said, just like the margin. And for the border, we see actually we got a bit more. We don't just have border style, color, and width. We can even set long form properties for the different sides. So for the top border, we could style that differently than the bottom border. So this is how the short ends are combined here. And this is just something to be aware of. You can always use the long form. And if you just want to set a margin top, for example, it's better to just set margin top rather than margin with the 4 value syntax and then set 3 of them to 0. But you can always use both, and behind the scenes, this is what will get rendered. Enough about the shorthands, let's go back to code. I will remove the margin, border, and for now also the padding of the product overview. So if we save this and reload, we're back to where we were. Well, with one difference, we no longer have the margin implied by the body. That white space to the top is coming from the H1 element. Now we can also set something different. We can set a width and a height. So on the product overview, we can set the width to 100%, for example, to tell it to take the full entire width of this page. Now if we reload, we don't really see a change because that was its default behavior anyways, because sections like divs or like H1 elements are block level elements. Now this is some HTML feature not related to CSS, but it's important to keep in mind block level elements, unlike inline elements like anchor tags for example, block level elements always take the full available width by default. So width 100% actually doesn't do anything. If we set it to something different than 100% though, let's say to 50, then we can see that if we reload, this shrinks our box to 50% of the width of the surrounding container. Here it looks like 50% of the page width, and it is the case, but that's simply happening because the surrounding container is a main element, which also is a block level element, which therefore has a width of 100%. So 50% of the surrounding container, which has 100% of the page width, yields 50% of the page width here too. But if the main element had a lower width too, then the section would only get half of that. So width can be used either with percentages or, of course, with absolute values like 300 pixels. This is also possible, and this shrinks the box. If I increase that to, let's say, 700, you'll see it gets bigger. Like that. So this is the width we can set, and this will become important throughout the course because we don't want all elements to be 100% of the page width. We can also set the height, of course. Now for the height, it's tricky. If you set height 100% and you expect it to now get the height of the full page, well, you're going to be sad. As you can see, it now only got a little bit bigger. The only thing it now does is it includes the height of the margin of the H1 element. The reason for that is that 100% refers to the available height given by the parent container. Now, if you hover over the main container, you could see, well, the blue area is much bigger than the tiny bit our red box grow by. But that area that height of the main element is calculated dynamically by the content it holds. So it's only as big as its content requires it to be. Now that of course creates kind of an infinite loop. If we say a part of the content should be 100% of the size of the main area, and the main area says I'm only as big as I need to be, then the 100% basically has no effect. If you wanted it to have an effect, you would need to change the height of the main area too. So if I do this here in the developer tools, which only will change it temporarily until we refresh the page, I could set the height of the main area to, let's say, 500 pixels. And if we do that, you can inspect the section here, and you will see on the top left, you can see it, that it now has a height of 500 pixels. Exactly the height we set on the main area. So if we give this an explicit height, then the child, if we use percentages, will again refer to that, just as it's the case with the width. If we set the height of the main area to 100%, we're now referring to its parent, which is the body, and that again is only as big as it needs to be. So we get the same situation as before. So only if we set the body to a height 100% too, and we do the same for HTML, which is the parent of the body, which is only as big as it needs to be. So now if we set this to 100% on HTML2, now we finally get a red area that is just as big as our page. Because now, starting at the HTML element, which now refers to the overall window if we set height to 100%, we pass the relative height of 100% down to that section. So if you ever want to style the height of an element relative to the height of your page, you need to create such a chain where you pass the page height down. In the dimensions and units section later in the course, we'll also learn about a different, more modern unit, which allows you to achieve this a bit easier with worse browser support though. But for now, this is a cool trick to keep in mind, how you can set the height to 100%. Now this is not necessarily what I want to do here though. I can simply set this to an absolute value. For example, we could set this to a value of, let's say, 528 pixels. If we now reload, this is the size our red area has. I'll also set the width back to 100%, though I could omit this because that's the default anyways, but for now I'll leave it here so that we have that for reference. So that is how width and height work in general. We can use them with percentages or pixels or other units, which we'll cover later. But there's actually a bit more to width and height, especially if we consider the box model. Let's dive into that in the next lecture. So in the last lecture, we worked with height and width. Well, that's all nice. We changed the height and width of the box, unsurprisingly. But what exactly did we change? When we set the height and the width, did we set the height and width of the content plus the padding, of the content, the padding, and the border, or of the content, the padding, the border, and the margin? Well, let's take a look. Let's take a look by inspecting that section where we did set width and height. There, if we scroll down to our box model, what we can see is that in there we set the width and height of our box here, I'd say. The width is calculated dynamically as we increase and decrease the page width because it's set to 100%, and the height is the 522 pixels we added in our code. But let's now quickly add some padding back to the party. Let's maybe add a padding of 10 pixels, a border of 5 pixels solid and black, and a margin of 10 pixels. If we now save this and we reload the page, we can already see one strange thing. It shifted a little bit to the right. The 100% width leads to our red element to go out of the right side of our page. And that doesn't change if we decrease and increase the page width because it's already set to 100%. So something seems to be wrong with the width. If we scroll down to our box model again, we now see something strange. The height really is 528 pixels for the content. The width is 100% of our content too. But now the padding, border, and margin add up to that. So what we actually now got is a total width and height that's bigger than what we specified. And we can see the total values if we simply hover over it. We can see that the actual width of our element is 937 and that the actual height is 558. Now, if we go back to our box model here in the developer tools, the height was 558. Well, if we add up, that's 528 plus 10 plus 10, so 548 plus 5 plus 5. So we set the height and width of the content, and padding and border is not included into our calculation or is not part of what width and height target. It is what the browser in the end adds up to it though, which leads to our element being positioned incorrectly. This happens because all elements by default happen to have a certain way of calculating width and height, which is called content box. We can set this behavior by adding the box sizing property to the element where we want to change it. And as I said, the default here is content box. This means if we set a width and height, we set width and height of the content, not of the entire box, including padding and border. We can set it to border box though. Now width and height include padding and border. They don't include the margin, and we can't make it to include that. With that set, however, if we save the file and reload, we still see that the element goes out of the page because the margin is not included in the calculation. But if we go down, we see that actually it now only has a height of 498, because now if we add 10 times 2 for the padding and 5 times 2 for the border, now we end up with the 528, which is our height, which now again targets content plus padding plus border. And that often is the setting you want to use. It's actually so common that you often override the styling for all your elements to always use box sizing border box, because it's more convenient to think of the height and width referring to the entire box without margin than to just the content. Now, as I said, margin is never included, so to avoid that effect where your element is moved to the left, you simply have to remove the margin, which I guess makes sense. If you want your element to sit right on the edge, don't add a margin after your element. It makes sense that this is not part of the width and height. So box sizing, border box, really, really useful. And as I said, so important and useful that it's often used as a default style for all elements anyways. And this is also what I want to do here. So we could add it to body. And if we do that and save and reload the page and go back to the box model, we see we're back in content box world. The reason for this is that we're now inheriting the box sizing setup, but actually we don't see it here as a browser default style, but because it's a block level element here by default, this is overridden automatically. So actually our nice inheritance doesn't take effect because the browser sets its own box sizing because section is a block level element. Therefore, what we have to do is we have to use the universal selector. And that is one of the rare cases where you really use it if you want to reset all elements to have a certain behavior, like using box sizing border box. Then you use the universal selector, because this is now not using inheritance. It's not using the same mechanism as setting this on body head. It's really targeting every element on its own, hence overwriting inheritance and also overwriting browser defaults, and sets the box sizing to border box. And I will leave this for the entire course project because I always want to target content, padding, and border when setting width and height. So with that added, if we now reload and go back, we see we're back in a world where our content is only width and height without padding and border, so that if we set a width or height, we actually include padding and border in the calculation. So with all that theory out of the way, it's time to continue working on our course project and make sure we take the next major step when it comes to that. And for that, I'll first of all get rid of that ugly border, get rid of that margin we don't need, and yeah, I'll leave the padding for now, I guess. So if we save this and reload, this is what we end up with. Looks a bit nicer. Now I want to add a navigation bar too. And for that, I attached a file where you find some HTML code which will now add to our index.html file. There, above the main section, we'll paste in the code you find in that attached file, which is a header element with some div inside of it, with a nav element, which then in turn has an unordered list with list items that should become our application navigation. This is some typical markup which you might see in this form or slight variations in your web pages. Here are some links. They all won't work for now, but we'll add these pages throughout the course. And if we save that, and also save the updated main.css file, of course, and reload it, we got this ugly part at the top. Now, our goal for the next lectures will be to turn this into a non-ugly part. So we'll add our header. And we can start by simply selecting the header element itself. Now, of course, what we can do is we can now simply add header like this. We can target the header element by the element selector. The downside of this is that we might use multiple headers in a web page. It's not limited to the navigation. The header element actually can also be used within a section, for example. So therefore, using header here is not really the best way. Would be better to define our own class. So I'll add main-header. The class name is totally up to you, but it should be descriptive. And here I name it main header because I believe this clearly indicates this is the main header of our page, not some section header or anything like that. Now this class, of course, needs to be attached to the header element then. So let's go to the HTML code and add the main header class. So now the main header is defined such that we can start using or can start styling it. Now, which styles can we attach here? Of course, any styles you want, but I want to create a header which spans the full width, which has a green background color, as this will be kind of the main theme color our application will use. Of course, you're always free to choose a different one. And I also want to give it some padding so that the text in the header or the content of the header doesn't directly sit on its edges. Now that is a good practice for you. The goal is to add a background color, to add some padding, and set the width to the full page width. These are all things we already practiced, so here's your chance to pause the video and then do this on your own. And after you unpause, we'll do it together. Were you successful? Let's do it together. To set the width to 100%, we simply add width 100%. And this is kind of optional because it's a block level element. It takes the full entire width anyways, but it's still something we can set up, especially as we later in the course will revisit this and style this differently where this will actually become important. Now, besides that, we want to set a background color. Now, I mentioned I want to use a green, and maybe you just used green, which is fine, but I prepared a special hex code, a nice green I personally like, and it's 2DDF5C. Of course, you're free to choose any green you want. It's the same green we used for the section title, though. Finally, some padding. Now here, I'll add a padding to top and bottom and left and right, but I want to use different values. I want to use the same padding for the top and the bottom, and the same padding for the left and the right, but not the same padding for top, bottom, left, and right. So what we can do is we can use this two-value shorthand I showed you in an earlier slide, and I'll set the padding to top and bottom to 8 pixels, and to left and right to 16 pixels, like this. If we now save this and we reload the page, we got that green header. We also see that our text doesn't directly touch the edges anymore. From a styling perspective, we can still improve this a bit in my opinion though. For example, this unordered list doesn't look that great. And by the way, if you don't like that color edge here, we'll also replace the red color with the image later on. So let's continue with the header though. We made a great first step, but the list items positioned like this, that's not really helpful. We don't want to have a list rendered like that. We just want to use a list semantically, but from a styling perspective, all these list items should sit next to each other, not on top of each other. Now, to achieve this, we'll actually need to dive into a new property, the display property. Let's explore it in the next lecture. So we started adding the header, and I mentioned we would need the display property to change the way our list items are positioned. And we do. Now, let's first of all start by being able to target these list items. And to do so, I'll give them a CSS class. So I'll add the class attribute to a list item, and now you can again use any class name you want. I will use a certain way of writing classes, which is called BEM for block element modifier, something I will explain in detail at the end of the course in this patterns and best practices part, where I will also explore that. It's just a specific way of writing classes that should ensure that we don't accidentally reuse class names and that they're very clear about what we do. Hence, what I'll name them, or what I'll name this class, is main-nav and then __ item. Again, you can give this any name you want. This just is kind of following the theme where we're in the main navigation, because this will become the main nav, and then in there, and it's just separated by specification of that BEM model I'm following, there we are in a single list item. You can again name this in whichever way you want. I'll copy that class assignment and add it to all my list items. I'll also add it to the unordered list, though there I will name it main_nav __ items, because this is my list of items. And then finally, once we're already added, I'll also add it to the nav element, and there it will be just the class main_nav. And that's kind of the pattern I want to use here: main_nav, main_nav items, main_nav item. So with that, we get a bunch of classes with which we can work. We came here to see the display property in action though, right? So how does that work? The display property allows us to change the behavior of an element from block to inline, or even to inline block, which is a mixture, or to none to remove it from the DOM even. Now, step by step, what does this all mean? In HTML, we got inline and we got block level elements. Example for inline elements would be anchor tags. They are rendered in line. If we have two anchor tags after each other, as here for customers, and we reload the page, we see they're rendered in the same line. They don't take the full entire width as block level elements do. That, on the other end, is what block level elements do. If we inspect a list item, so not the anchor tag inside of it, just the list item, you can see the blue content takes the full available width minus margin padding, what's taken up by other elements surrounding it. The anchor tag, again, only takes the width its content needs. Both actually use the box model, though for the inline element, we can't really set a margin top and bottom, for example, because that's not how inline elements work. They are not positioned in the flow like block level elements. They don't take a new line necessarily. Hence, margin top and bottom is difficult, because they might be inline with another element. So that's the difference, and we can change that behavior with the display property. Here's an example. Let's go to that second customer, and let's quickly, for demo purposes, change the style with display to block. Again, the default value for an anchor tag would be inline, but here I change it to block. If we do that and we reload the page, you actually see that this second customer jumped into a new row, because customer, the second one, is now turned into a block level element, and hence it behaves like one. It takes the full entire width. The first one still is an inline element, but that doesn't matter, because the second one is a block level. It doesn't fit into the same line as the first one, even though that one is still inline, but the second one isn't. Now, that what we enforced with display block is actually the default for block level elements like unordered list, list item, nav, section, and so on. With the display property, we can change it. Now, one other way we can change it is we can set it to none. If we set this on the second customer and we reload, you see it's removed. And it's not only invisible or transparent, it's also taken out of the document flow, as you can tell by the fact that start hosting closed the gap. If we inspect it here, this is the element which has display none. It's still part of the DOM though, so it's not removed from there, just from the visible document flow. The idea behind display none is that it's especially useful if we use it in conjunction with JavaScript to, for example, show it after a button was clicked. This allows us to create modals which only show up on certain action, something we'll also do later. So that is none, that is block, and that is inline. Changing inline to block and the other way around is not that useful in many cases because elements behave in a certain way for a good reason. But there's a fourth option, and that's the option that's now really useful to us. We can set our class, which we assign to a list item, so the main nav item class, we can set that in our CSS code, don't forget the dot, to display inline dash block. This mixes the behavior of both inline and block level elements. Like inline elements, these elements can go next to each other now, but they still behave like block level elements when it comes to setting top and bottom margins, setting paddings, things that are not possible on inline elements. If we change it to such an element, we can go back to the code, and after reloading, we see that now the list items are set up in one line, because again, they behave like an inline element such that they only take as much width as their content needs and they fit into one line. But they still have a box where we can set a padding and so on. And you can see this if you actually try setting a padding, for example, on the anchor tag, so padding 20 pixels, then you see it's applied to the left and right, but just as margin top and bottom, it doesn't really have a great effect here. If you, on the other hand, set that on the surrounding list item, which is inline block, then you see it's also applied to the left and right, but to the top and bottom, it's also having an effect now. It's pushing the elements down. So that's the difference. We can style the list items still like block level elements, but they sit next to each other like inline elements, which is a great way of allowing us to create a navigation here. Later in the course, we'll also learn about other tools, mainly Flexbox, which is even better to position elements next to each other. But for now, inline block is a great start. So now that you had a brief introduction to that display property and especially inline block, try taking this to the next level. If you have a look at our navigation, in the header to be precise, we still have a problem. Our div, which holds our brand link, still is on a different line than the nav. Because both div and nav elements are block level elements, hence they take the full available width and don't go into the same line. Here is your challenge. Add code that ensures that both now sit in the same line. You again can now pause the video and thereafter we'll do it together. Were you successful? Let's do it together. So the goal will be to turn this div and this nav into an inline block element. Now for that, we can add a class to this first div. Now we can do that, and it would not be bad, even might be the best option of doing that, but I also want to practice a combinator again. So what I'll do in main CSS, here, after main header, before main nav item, not because the priority matters, but because it makes more sense reading the HTML file from top to bottom, I'll add main header and then the direct child combinator to directly select a div. Now I only want to select a div that's a direct child because later in the course we might add some nested divs somewhere in the header. So this will now only select this div and any div siblings of that div if there were any. And now we can give this a style of display inline block like this. If we do that and we go back to the page, nothing changed. Well, because the nav element also still is a block level element. Now the nav element has a class, and of course we could also select nav with a direct child combinator. I just wanted to throw this in here real quick. It's generally better to use direct selectors like this class selector. So now we'll take the main nav class, which sits on the nav element here. And in the main CSS, I'll now also add some styling for that by selecting it with .mainNav. And in there, well, display inline block is what we need. If we add this here and we go back and reload, now they're in the same line. So this is looking much better now. And this already is the solution to the tiny task I gave you. Now, what we also could do now is we could try to move the elements in that nav element to the right. Now, one thing we can try is, since we have an unordered list with list items that are also turned to inline block, we could use text align on the main nav element to align all our text, and inline block elements will be treated as text, to the right. So we could add text align right to the main nav element. If we do that and we reload, nothing changed, I guess. If we inspect the nav, well, we actually see the elements are aligned to the right, and we can confirm this by selecting the nav. Here we got text align right, and if you argue that doesn't matter because list items are children of unordered list, well, this also has it due to inheritance. So here, text align right is inherited from main nav. So this is getting applied, but it doesn't have an effect because unordered list sits inside nav, which is an inline block element, and which therefore doesn't take the full available width. It only has as much width as its content needs. Hence, text align right doesn't do anything here. So we instead need to set a width. And the width should be the width of our header minus the width of this div here at the beginning. Now then we would still have a problem because that unordered list in there still has an additional padding. If you go down, you see we got a padding to the left, and we also got margin to top and bottom even. So we first of all should reset that before we try changing the width of the main navigation. So back in code, in index.html, we see this unordered list where I just said I want to reset padding and margin. It has the main nav items class. So if we copy that class name and we add that with the class selector, we can actually set margin to 0 here and padding to reset all these basic settings or remove them essentially. There's one additional property which we can set, and that is list style none. This removes the bullet points, though setting the padding to 0 will also remove them, but that really ensures that there are no bullet points. With that, we can now change the width of main nav. We could set it to 100%. If we do that and we reload, yeah, it's on the right, but it's also in a new line if you watch closely, which makes sense. The nav now takes the full available width, minus the padding of the header, and therefore it doesn't fit into a line with our first div here anymore. So what we need to do is take 100% minus the width of that div. And that div, if we scroll down, has a width of 48.134. Now, reading this from the rendered page like this is not the best possible approach, to be honest. We'll find a cleaner approach later once we got more powerful tools. For now, what we can do is we can take that value. So let's make it 49 and subtract that from 100%. And CSS got a function, a helper for that, the calc function. We can assign this as a value too. And calc takes a simple calculation. Here, the calculation would be 100% minus, and the white space between the number and the minus does matter, white space, and then the value you want to subtract. For example, 49 pixels. If you now save this and you reload, it became narrower, but it's still in a new line. And that is something that is related to inline block. And it's super important to be aware of this behavior because that can cost you hours otherwise. So what's causing this navigation element to sit in a new line even though we're assigning a width which is 100% minus the width of that div. Now you could say it's the padding of the header, but that's not the case. We got box sizing border box, so padding is included in all width calculations. So width 100% already is header width minus the padding of the header. So that's not the case. Instead, it's something related to display inline block. If you go to your HTML code, it's this white space you have in the editor here. Now that's super dumb, but in your editor, you of course structure code like this. And this normally doesn't cause any issues. But actually, this empty white space is considered a character and is added as an extra inline element. So you don't just have the width of that inline element you have to subtract, it's also the width of that white space. And of course, that's really hard to measure because you don't even see that in the developer tools really good. So what you can do is you can remove it in your editor like this. If you do that, so that the nav directly begins after the div and there's no space in between, then you can reload and actually you see it's in the same line now. But that really is not that much fun. So a better way, since we want to structure our code, is to instead simply subtract a bit more, like 54 pixels. And if that sounds hacky to you, it is, and a cleaner solution will follow in this course. But with that subtracted, it now also fits into one line, even as we decrease the size. If we go to a very small page size, it looks ugly, but we'll take care about responsive design in an extra module, or from an extra module on too. So this now works. Let's now continue styling this now that display inline block does its job. So the navigation is taking shape. Let's now work on our brand. Doesn't really stand out, does it? So back to our code, I want to change its appearance. For that, it makes sense to give this anchor tag, which holds our brand text, a new class. And this class could be main-header__brand, or just brand, whatever you want to call it. So it's my main header brand. And with that class added, we can of course use that class in the CSS file to give it some extra styling. Now from a position perspective, I'll add it after this child combinator rule here, because that is where I'm, working with that div that contains the brand. And now in there, the question just is, how do we style that brand? Well, let's say we want to remove that underlining we have there by default. Let's say we want to change the color and maybe also the font weight, the boldness, turn this to bold text here, that this is bold. We can do all these things, and let's start with the color. For the color, I prepared another darker green, which is 0E4F1F as a hex code. If we save that, we got this green color. Now the text decoration still is ugly, so it is underlining, and we can remove it by adding the text minus decoration property and setting it to none. By that, we clear that default style, which is set by the browser, by the way, in case you're wondering. You can always check that here. Text decoration underline, it's a browser default. If you now reload this, it's gone because we override it with our own rule. And now let's make this a bit bolder. And for that, I'll add a font weight of bold. Now, since we use our default font here, which is Montserrat, and we're importing a bold version of that font here, we can use that and bold will work. So with that, if we go back and reload, now we got a bold font. This also increased the size of it, so our other items jump into a new line. So since we have that hacky approach right now, let's quickly fix it. By finding out the width of that, it only increased by a little bit. So we should be fine if we deduct 55 from 100% for main nav. And we are. And now with that, we got our, nicer looking brand. Maybe we also increase the font size, which will require us to adjust this again. But let's first of all increase it. Let's set the font size maybe to 22 pixels or something like that. We reload again, jumps into a new line. So if we again inspect that, it's now 69 roughly. So deducting 74, you can always add like 5 to the value you see on the page, should do the trick. And it does. So now we got this brand set up here. Now, one thing you might notice is that this is not aligned in the middle perfectly anymore. The brand actually looks good because this font size, this height of the brand actually sets the height of the entire header, so to say. But the other text here on the right, which is smaller because we don't use font size 22 pixels there, actually is now aligned to the bottom of the first word of the brand. This can be the behavior you want, but here it actually isn't. There is another property we can use. We can add it on our nav inline block element, so the element which sits next to our div holding the brand. Let's add it inline here so that we can immediately see the effect. It's called vertical align, and we can set it to middle. Now we need to set it on both elements that should be aligned though, not just on the nav, but also on the div. If we also set middle there, now the div here and the nav should be aligned to each other in their middles. Now, of course, we don't want to do that just in the browser. We want to do that in our code. So let's target this div and let's say set vertical align middle here. So that's the div holding our brand. And let's do the same for main nav, of course. So for main nav, I'll also set vertical align to middle. With these two changes in place, if we now reload, now this is aligned in the middle again. Cool. So now we can continue working on these links on the right. And this is another challenge for you. Let's dive into it in the next video. So here's your challenge. I want you to style these links on the right here to have a little bit more distance from each other. Keep in mind, you are limited regarding margin top and bottom when it comes to inline block elements, but left and right should work. And I also want you to make sure that the anchor tags in these list items do actually have green text, the same green text we have for the brand by default, and that they're not underlined. This is using a couple of concepts taught in the previous lectures and even the last module. Good luck with that. Here's your chance to pause the video. Thereafter, we'll, as always, do it together. So were you successful? Let's do it together. So to change the styling as we want it, I'll first of all add a little bit of margin between the items here. So on main nav item, I'll now add a margin, and I only want margin on left and right because top and bottom won't work anyways and I don't want it. So I'll use that to-value shorthand. The first value refers to top and bottom. I'll set that to 0. The second value is left and right, and there I'll use 16 pixels, like that. If we do that and we reload, now we got more spacing. And also notice that this doesn't lead this to jump into a new line again because margin is not included in the width calculation. So this now positions them nicely. Let's now take care about the underlining and color. Now we can add text decoration none to our main nav item. If we save that and reload, the text decoration is still there. Let's inspect that item. The problem is, it's our anchor tag where this text decoration underline is set by default by the browser. So changing it on the list item doesn't do anything. It could be inherited in theory, though not even that is happening, but even then it would be overwritten because even browser defaults do have the lowest priority, but even they directly target the element, so they would override inheritance. So setting text decoration here doesn't work. Now we got at least two alternatives to solve this. The first alternative is to assign a CSS class to all the anchor tags in our list items. So we could give each anchor tag a class. We can also use a combinator. So here I'll use main, nav, item, a to select the anchor tag. Now what is better, using a class or using that combinator? From a performance perspective, assigning a class should be a little bit faster, though I will say, unless you're building the next Facebook at least, you will probably not notice this. And especially for cases like this, where you have one anchor tag directly, so as a direct child, nested in an item with a class, This is a high performance selector too. So performance isn't even that much worse here. So that is perfectly fine to use. And often it's just unnecessary to create an extra class, though you could do that. This is a perfectly fine way of selecting that nested element. So with it selected, we can of course style it now. So let's style it by removing the text decoration, setting it to none, giving it this darker green color with that hex code we used before, and saving this. Now if we reload, these are our links. They look better. Now as a next step, I wanna change the appearance when we hover over them. So that's something we'll cover in the next video. We're making good progress. Our links do look better, but wouldn't it be nice if they changed their style if we hover over them or if we keep clicking on them? So if we hold the mouse button, which is like a touch event on a mobile phone, that would be great. And of course, we can style that too with CSS. We use so-called pseudo classes for that. Now, how does this work? Let me show you what it is, and then I'll explain how it works. We again add our selector main nav item A, just as before, but now we add a pseudo class to the anchor tag selector. We do this by adding a colon directly after it, so there's no white space in between, because that would just be another descendant combinator and would select elements over which we hover which are nested inside the anchor tag. We want to fetch the hover on the anchor tag. The colon alone doesn't listen to hover though, but colon hover is just one of many pseudo classes we can attach. Another one would be the active one. So let's quickly copy that and create a second rule and assign the active pseudo class here. Now we can assign our rules. And for example, we could say that upon hovering, we want to have a white color and we want to have the same style for the active click, so once we hold the mouse pressed. If we save that and reload, we can hover over these and now the color changes. And it also keeps changing or keeps changed if I hold my mouse button. So this is how we can use such a pseudo class. Now, which other pseudo classes do exist and what exactly does this pseudo thing mean? We actually have to differentiate between pseudo classes and pseudo elements. So what does this pseudo thing mean? Pseudo classes define a style or allow us to define a style for a special state of an element, like the hover or active state. Pseudo elements allow us to define the style of a specific part of an element. Pseudo classes are defined with a single colon and then the class name, like hover or active. And pseudo elements are defined by adding two colons and then the element name. And it's about the state versus the part. That's the difference. Now, you can see a list of available pseudo classes on MDN. Link to that can be found in the last lecture of this module. There you find a short introduction and then an index of standard pseudo classes. Now there, you can always click on one if you want to learn more. What we got, for example, is of course the hover pseudo class we just used. But there are also classes that allow you to select like the first element of a given type. So if you have a paragraph selector, you can add the first of type pseudo class to only select the first paragraph in a given list of paragraphs. We're talking about siblings here, and so on. So really feel free to dive into them. To be very honest, there's only a couple of them which you use, and you will see them all throughout the course. For example, we also got focus, which is helpful for styling selected input elements. But it's nice to dive into all of them and get a brief overview over what you can do with them. Always keep in mind, they allow us to control different states or to be more precise about what we want to select, like with first child or first of type. A pseudo element, as mentioned on the slide, allows you to select a specific part of an element. Now here's also a short index and there are less such elements. And a good example actually is the first letter. It allows you to simply style the first letter of an element, like for a paragraph, differently than the rest, which of course is great for building blog pages, for example. you can get this newspaper style where the first letter or first line differs from the other ones. So let's quickly dive into some of them, including the after pseudo element, which is also a pretty interesting one. So let's quickly explore these pseudo elements. And let's say here, in the paragraph we already got at the bottom, we want to change it with the pseudo element first letter. So we want to change that M, that first letter. Now that's the only paragraph we got, and we'll remove that code anyways, but for now we can simply select it with paragraph, and then pseudo element, ::, first dash letter. And now we could set the color to red and the font size to 20 pixels. If we do that, and we reload our page, you can see the M is bigger and it's red. So this is first letter. Now let me remove this, it was just an example. Very interesting are the after and before pseudo elements. They actually allow you to render content through CSS. And this should only be helpful content which adds to the design, not crucial page content. Such content should always go into HTML, especially for accessibility reasons. But what we can do with that, for example, is we can mark links in an even clearer way if we wanted to do that. So in our example, we're selecting a link here with main nav item A. Now we could add another selector, main nav item A, and then add after. And this now allows us to set a special property, which we can only set on after and before, the content property. Content takes a string, and this is now some content which will be added to the DOM. Here we could, for example, render a link text, maybe with a white space in front of it so that it doesn't get directly attached to the old text. And now we can also style that content. For example, we could set the color to red. If we do that and we go back to our page and reload, you now see all our links here in the nav items array have that red link after them, which is part of the content which we can also click. So this is how we can use after and before. Can be nice to render a little helper icon after a text like this. This will be opened in a new tab icon you see on some pages, stuff like that. I will also remove this for now, but it's useful to know that with pseudo elements you can control parts of an element, whereas the pseudo classes like hover allow you to control what you select or the state of an element. That was a little dive into pseudo classes and elements. Now I removed the code because for now we'll focus on hover and active, which adds some real benefit to our page, namely that we can hover or click on our links and see a different style. So now with that little dive into pseudo classes and pseudo elements, let's dive into something else. Do you notice these two rules? They're exactly equal if we leave out the selector, which of course differs. If you got a case like this, you can group them into one rule. Because repeating code like this is not good, and if you ever change the color, you have to change it in two places. So what we can do is we can group the two rules by adding a comma after the first one, and then in the same or in the next line, I always add in the next line because it's easier to read, we add the next selector we want to add to the group. And you can add as many as you want. Important, this is not a combinator. These two rules, these two selectors, are not related at all. They just share the same declaration set. So now we can remove that active rule and still get the same effect because now it's simply grouped into one rule, into one assignment. So if we reload the page, we still got the hover and hold effect. So this still works. It's now just in one group, in one rule. I'm liking the shape of our application. We're really making good progress. What I'd also like is a little bit of a different style if we hover over these links. It would be nice if they by default, not only if we hover over them, would be bold. Well, that's easy to achieve, of course. But if they also had like a border at the bottom, we could re-add text decoration, but that underlining was very close to the text. I'd like a real border with some padding in between. Now let's start with the bold part. That's easy. We can simply add font weight bold to our nav item. If we go back and reload, it's bold, unsurprisingly. Now regarding the underlining, that is something I want to do with a border. Now for that, we can add border dash bottom. This is another shorthand which only styles the bottom border. And there we can, for example, set this to 5 pixels, solid and white. If we save that and we reload the page, we always got that. I, of course, only want it if I hover over it. So let's copy it to that style, So only to the hover and active style. If we now reload, we got it if I hover over it. But it's still very close. I want to have some padding in between. So let's go back and let's add a padding to the anchor tag. Not only when we're hovering over it, but always. Otherwise, we'll see some ugly jumping. So here we can add a padding into all directions or just top and bottom, whatever you want. Let's say top and bottom of 3 pixels. So 0 to left and right. If we now go back, that did work just fine. Now, the last thing I want to add for this navigation, this start hosting button here, or link, should actually look a bit different. It should be our call to action link. So it should really stand out from the rest and have a different styling. Now let's style that in the next lecture. So my idea is to turn this last list item into a call to action button. So this should really stand out from the other links, should be clearly visible. To ensure that we can style it that way, I'll add an extra class. And that's important. You can add more than one class to an element. So here, I'll simply add a white space after the first class and then add my second class. Here, I'll name the class main nav __ item and then dash dash CTA. That name might look very ugly and strange. It's again following this BEM way of naming classes. We have a main nav item still, but it has a special state, so to say, and you, per the BEM specification, separate this with 2 dashes and then the state name, which of course is set by you. Here, CTA for call to action. So now with that extra class added, I can target either of them to style this link. And we do use the first one, of course. We always did over the last lectures. But now this second class can be used to also style this. And since it only is applied to this list item, the other links won't be affected by it. So I'll go back to the main.css file and I'll add a new rule, main nav item CTA. To be precise, I want to target the anchor tag inside of there, just as we did it for the normal main nav item. I'll now have to override anything that I want to have different than before. Now here, the order does matter. They have the same specificity because they both have a descendant combinator, they both target the anchor tag, they both have a class at the beginning. So for this and this rule, it's now really just the order in the file that's important. So now we can override the parts that we want to change for that call to action button. What I want to change is, I want to set the text color to white because I'll add a background color of this red color we used, this reddish color. I also want to change the padding. I want to use 8 pixels, top and bottom, and 16 pixels, left and right. And I also will give this a border radius of 8 pixels. Now, border radius is new. This will round the corners. If we save this, you can see it. Save both files, including the HTML file. If you now reload it, this is our call to action button, which looks really strange with that white border bottom hover effect here. But this is now our button, clearly standing out from the other links. And I would agree that with that color below there, that doesn't look that great. We'll replace it with the image soon. So now we got that button. The hover effect also needs to change now to make sure this looks good. So I'll add another rule, main nav item CTA a hover, and for active, so main nav item CTA a active. And here, I'll set the color of the text to the red color, and I'll set the background color to white, so I'll swap that essentially. And I also will remove that border assignment, which we have for normal link hover effects, so that we don't get that border bottom. Because again, order matters here, specificity would be the same. So this one resolves the conflict and it simply overrides all border settings that were made earlier. With that, if we reload again, now we have a different style when hovering over that, and now we added that CTA button. And that's it for now with the navigation. Now we'll revisit this, of course, later, a couple of times actually, to make it responsive and to also style it differently or position the elements differently. The next and last thing I want to do is I want to add an image here so that we got less of a harsh contrast. Let's do this in the next lecture. So let's add an image as a background for this area, for this reddish pink area here. Now, I added an image. You can find it attached to this video. It's this one here, Freedom, because we are a really great host with a lot of freedom for our customers. And we can add this as a background image for the product overview, where we have that other color right now, by simply removing the color assignment and using the URL helper method. This allows us to reference an image file which will be loaded as a background thereafter. URL takes a string, so you have to add double quotation marks, opening and closing. And in between, you add the path pointing to your image. This could also be a hyperreference, so HTTP something, some link to a file on a server, or a local file, as in our case. If it's in a subfolder, you would add subfolder / whatever, the path to the file. In this case, it's in the same folder, so I'll just add freedom JPEG. And that's all. If I add this and I reload, this adds the image. Now, it's too big, as you can see, but for now, this will do. This is better from a contrast perspective, in my opinion, than the solid color was. We'll work on positioning and working with that image in the background and images section, where you will learn a lot about how you can control that images and background images look exactly the way you want. To be precise, you will learn how you can center this and so on. Really cool stuff. For now, this does it though. Looks way better. The next goal will be to work on the remaining sections of our starting page. We'll dive into this in the next course module. Before we conclude this section and dive into the next module, I promised you that list of properties which are worth remembering. Now, keep in mind, properties are the part in front of the colon, and you might of course be wondering which ones you should use. You saw that long reference of properties, but here's a list of properties we already used and which you will see over and over again. The color property, to change a text color. The background color property, to change the background of a box. Display, to change the way it's positioned or it behaves from block to inline block to none. The padding, to add some distance between the content and the border. The border itself, to add a, border. Margin, to add some spacing around a box. The width, to, set the width. And the height, to set the height. There are more important properties, of course, which we'll see from time to time. And there are way more which you see or which you use very rarely. These are core properties which you already saw and which are definitely worth to remember. Now, we will see way more. We already did see more than just these few. But you can learn them and you will learn them by heart by simply using them. Don't go to a reference and learn them just by reading them. Use them, and that helps you really memorizing what they do and when to use them. So that's it for the module. What did we learn? We had a look at the box model, a core concept of CSS. Every element is treated as a box. No matter if it's an inline or block level element, it's treated as a box. The difference just is, for inline elements, margin top and bottom don't have an effect. They are applied, but you don't see it. But besides that, everything is a box, and understanding that you can set content, padding, border, and a margin is crucial. You also learn about width and height, that you can use pixels or percentage units. More units will also be covered in this course. And that you can also change what width and height refer to by changing the box sizing attribute. The default is content box, and with that setting you only style the content of the box. But you can set it to border box to actually target content, padding, and border with your width and height assignments. We then also had a look at the display property, somewhat connected to the box model, but then again not really. With it though, you can change the behavior of block level elements or inline elements. You can set a block level element to behave like an inline one, or the other way around, or use the combination with inline block. We used it to position elements next to each other. And also, don't forget, you can use display none to remove an element from the document flow. Not from the DOM, it's still included there as you saw in the developer tools. It's only removed from the document flow and from the page you see. And finally, we also covered pseudo classes and elements. Another core feature, with pseudo classes, you can style different states of elements or target different types of elements, like the first list item in a list of list items. And with pseudo elements, you can actually target content or parts of elements, like the first letter or some additional content which you define that should be added after an element and which you then also can style. This is what we covered, and definitely practice these things. Go back to this module if you later encounter something which is not clear or which you feel like you want to go through again. But with that, let's move on.